Pode ser o Grupo Corpo ou a Companhia de Dança do Pantanal. Museu de Arte Moderna de São Paulo ou Arte em Cores. Filarmônica de Minas Gerais ou Programa Vale Música. Restauração do Museu Nacional ou da Cripta da Basílica de Nazaré. Onde tem cultura, a Vale está. Dos projetos que todo mundo já conhece, até aqueles projetos que todo mundo precisa conhecer. A cultura brasileira tem o nosso apoio. É valorizando essa cultura que crescemos e evoluímos juntos. Instituto Cultural Vale.
Mobilidade é vida. Somos a CCR. Estamos presentes em 13 estados brasileiros e em outros 3 países. Unidos por um único propósito: melhorar a vida das pessoas através da mobilidade. A inovação sustentável nos aponta a direção, as necessidades de nossos clientes, as oportunidades. Valorizamos os encontros, valorizamos a vida.
Caixa, o banco com milhões de clientes que sempre tem um olhar especial para quem mais importa, você. É por você que tem nos benefícios sociais a esperança para superar os desafios. É por você que tem direito à moradia digna e quer realizar o sonho da casa própria. É por um país que acredita na união e reconstrução, com mais diversidade, sustentabilidade e muitas oportunidades. Caixa, é por você, é por um novo Brasil.
Com as desculpas para não procurar o Sebrae. É empreendedor? Ligue, mande um zap, vá ao Sebrae ou ele vai até você. Ah, e tem tudo no portal. Sebrae, a força do empreendedor brasileiro.
Eu que atuo nessa área do turismo, eu vejo que existe um turismo um pouco descontrolado, né? Então eu me preocupo muito com as causas ambientais, ecológicas, então eu espero que a gente continue preservando, quer dizer, preserve ainda mais o que a gente já tem, que eu vejo um certo descaso ainda, não só das autoridades, mas até também uma certa parte da população que ainda não tem uma educação completa, né? Então, eu acho que a educação é a coisa mais importante para qualquer povo, cultura, né? As pessoas estarem sendo informadas para proteger o que é delas e manter a identidade também dessas pessoas, dessas comunidades, os caiçaras, os quilombolas que estão aqui, né? Ainda estão aqui. E e acabar com esse turismo de uma certa forma predatório. Nosso território ainda constitui bastante unidades de conservação, então que essas unidades continuem capacitando as pessoas, os jovens de Paraty, locais, né, oferecendo essa educação de base, trabalhos também, né, de base para os jovens, pessoas desempregadas que possam estar, sei lá, exercendo qualquer tipo de função, seja voluntário ou não, mas que mantenham o turismo também controlado, né? A gente não pode ter essa coisa desenfreada de pensar na quantidade, né? Atrair o máximo de pessoas possíveis. Acho que não, tem que ter um certo controle, né? Um certo defeso também dessa coisa aqui de Paraty, da comunidade e da preservação. Então, a tecla mesmo é a educação, né? Tá educando os jovens, principalmente as crianças, que às vezes estão muito carentes aí, e é isso, né? A educação é o principal para qualquer povo.
Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade. Ministério da Cultura e a Associação Casa Azul apresentam 21ª Flip, Festa Literária Internacional de Paraty. A Flip conta com benefício da Lei de Incentivo à Cultura, Lei Rouanet, PRONAC 231427, e possui acessibilidade para pessoas com deficiência física, visual e auditiva. Tem patrocínio Master, Instituto Cultural Vale. Patrocínio Ouro, Itaú. CCR e Caixa. Patrocínio Prata, o Globo, Mac Imóveis e Sebrae. Patrocínio Bronze, Globo Livros e Eletronuclear. Parceria institucional SESC. Prefeitura de Paraty, Embratur e Museu do Território. É uma concepção, Associação Casa Azul. Realização, Ministério da Cultura, Governo Federal, Brasil, União e Reconstrução. Flip, o encontro da literatura com a cidade.
Olá, boa tarde. Eu sou a Fernanda.
Good afternoon. I am Fernanda Bastos, along with Milena Brito. I am one of the curators. And we are reaching the before last session. We know it's raining, so we all should be inside to see the performance we have this evening by Nelson Maca and Débora Arruda. But now, for this meeting, for this session, I would like to invite the writer and journalist Anabela Mota Ribeiro, and she will mediate Monique Roffey and Colombe Schneck. Thank you. I was missing you guys so much. In Colombe Schneck's books and in Monique Roffey's books, there are words that are never said. Mermaids that forget their mother tongue. There are enchantments, curses, mythological creatures from the Caribbean, concrete creatures of the bourgeois Paris, a feminist gesture, a political dimension that has to do with the woman's body and colonialism. Colombe and Monique will write with the strength of nature. They speak from within, with the absences and the dreams. It is an immense joy to be again in Paraty. And this is basically my condition as a flipper. And to be in this round table that has this mysterious sentence by Pagou: the birds hide away or shy away from men. I would like to thank, of course, curators, Fernanda Bastos and Milena Brito, for having trusted me to be mediating this session. But above all, this program that will bring fracture, that will find new pathways, that bring us awe, bewilderment, allows us to reflect this plural world we live in. It is very stimulating to have this gesture of getting to know, of meeting and to meet. It is a privilege to participate in this constellation that is being created as we move forward. The author's books published in Brazil are beautiful objects. And I will show you the books, 17 years, 17 ans, published by Relicari with a translation by Isadora Pontes and Laura Campos. And The Mermaid of Black Conch, edited by Darkside and translated by Marcela Filizola. After the session, both Colombe and Monique will be at Flip's bookshop signing their books. But before I start, I would like to remind you that you can also participate. You might submit your questions in writing, and the last minutes of our sessions will be dedicated to having your questions, the questions that will come from the audience. So during lunch we had earlier to organize our debate today, we all spoke in English. Now today, each one of us will speak our own native tongue. So for a creator to write and think in their native tongue, it is very important. And we will talk about this aspect of the mother tongue and the power of language. Languages, what do we want, what we are able to do with our languages. What would be, and I ask you, what is this non-contaminated language of a time that came before us, of birds and mermaids that hide away from men? But to begin, I would like to highlight a common trait in the writing of Colombe and Monique, and it has to do with a rebirth. Colombe finds herself another person. She is born again after the abortion she suffered at the 17 years of age. Monique's mermaid loses her tail, her scales, the taste of salt in a process of a metamorphosis that will allow her to be born and reborn as a woman. All of a sudden, there is this understanding that the world around you has changed, that there were tectonic movements that were felt. Should we start at this moment? Maybe Colombe, Monique? It's such a pleasure to address you.
Thank you. So I think when you say rebirth, and I think about my mermaid, her tail drops off. For me, I found an old story, very old, a myth, you know, and I knew it was. I knew immediately that I wanted to rewrite it, so that I could give my the young woman who was cursed, a second chance. So for me, you know, it was about revising a story and releasing a woman from a curse that she had suffered. So for me, it was just like, there's so much for me as a writer, contemporary feminist, to look at an old story and go, okay, now I get to, give this poor young woman who is exiled and cursed and also, banished from her sexuality. I can rewrite this. It's my privilege as a writer.
I wanted to thank all the women that allowed me to be here to publish this tiny book about abortion. It is a sequence of accidents that allowed me to write. I did not decide to write this book openly. It has to do with Annie Ernaux, who was here last year. And thanks to her, I wrote this book. She encouraged me by saying one day, an abortion is the most important thing that happened in my life. It is what determined all the rest that allowed me to come from life and death and come back to life. It's not something very little, it's not something small. There is much said about abortion, but not that much. Not many books, not many films. And abortion is sometimes a taboo. It is forgotten. It's something that has felt into oblivion as if it weren't important. But it is a very important topic for men and women. And having published this book today, and if I'm here today, it's because many women came before me. Juliette Jost and Ernaux, and I think about Michelle and Mayra from Relicário, who have edited me, Laura and Isabel, who have translated me, and I would like to thank them also for that. So this book I wrote without deciding I wanted to write. One day, Annie Ernaux said, she called me and she said, not me, all women that had gone through abortions, about these two, the children that you never talk about, as if we were ashamed because it's a taboo and because you never talk about this, you hide this. Your right might disappear if we don't talk about. So she wanted, as if she was like pointed a finger at me, you have the chance of making abortion legal and you have to write about this. So I came back to my house and I wrote really fast this text that exists today. And I understood all of a sudden, as you said, that I was going into another world. Before my abortion, I wasn't a girl or a boy. I was maybe a little feral being. I was very free, and I was a teenager, and I had my sexual life. I'm free, and maybe in the history of the world, will there be people that would be as free as I am? And that's what I thought about. And all of a sudden, I found myself pregnant because I had, of course, to do with my contraception, not the boy. I was the one that was responsible for it. It was the load that I had to carry at 17. And I was really pissed off. And I all of a sudden understood that I had a uterus, that I don't have the same body as the boys my age. I didn't have the same freedom. And people lied to me. And then I had I had the body of a woman, and I had to be very careful with it. It was projected to have children. There's no other destiny. And then the abortion brought me into this sort of, it was sort of a prison. And today I am free from that prison.
Bom, já foram abordados aqui.
So we already talked about different aspects that we will develop throughout our session. So we're talking about texts that have to do with a woman's body as a prison, as a curse, among other things. And before we develop even further this topic, I would like you to read excerpts from your book. If you could, maybe we start with Monique, if you could.
I'll read from the beginning, just the opening paragraph. David Baptiste's dreads are grey and his body wizened to twigs of hard black coral, but there are still a few people around St. Constance who remember him as a young man and his part in the events of 1976, when those white men from Florida came to fish for marlin and instead pulled a mermaid out of the sea. It happened in April, after the leatherbacks had started to migrate. Some said she arrived with them, and others said they'd seen her before, those who fished far out. But most people agreed that she would never have been caught at all if the two of them hadn't been carrying out some kind of flirty behavior. My voice.
Bom, o começo do livro da Monique.
So this was Monique's book. And now let's have the end of her book. I began by the end because there's no suspension. It's a story of an abortion, and we know how this goes, and we know how this ends. At the end of my book, I did not believe I didn't expect this. So I was addressing myself to the child who never was. So this woman was killed, and this was to the child I had never had. It is a type of recognition, and this is why I tried to write. You had to make do with the crumbs I threw at you. Once a year in the winter, and I don't even know what day you would have been born, only roughly that it could be sometimes in January or February '85. You sacrifice yourself for them. I came to understand this reading of Annie Ernaux in A Happening, she writes. Now I know that this ordeal and the sacrifice were necessary for me to want to have children. I fully believe it's a boy, a winter boy, born 30 years ago, who allowed me to be free, to be, by turns, a student, a traveler, lover, wife, mother, reader, tourist, journalist, and writer. With these few words, I am finally ready to reveal your absence. Thanks to the veil law, your absence is not the result of hours of cruelty, mistreatment, blood, fear, humiliation, and contempt. I did not do it with lightness of heart. It was neither comfortable nor convenient, nor banal. I was neither in distress nor in a state of high drama, but that spring, 1984, was, I understand now, an extreme human experience bearing on life and death, time, law, ethics, and taboo. I can finally write, your absence has accompanied me for 30 years. Your absence liberated me and made me the woman I am today. Now, a couple of questions. So, is it a matter of controlling a woman's body, a woman's sexuality? And here, I can maybe branch out and talk about what we're trying to control. My desire, my pleasure, my reproduction. Is it everything? Naturally, of course, but maybe any one of these and specifically. Is this an opposition between sexuality, a feminine sexuality, and God? Well, those who fear the sexuality of a woman, who is scared of the sexuality of a woman? Monique, please.
Oh gosh, good question. So I was attracted to the myth because it's not just a young woman that was cursed. There was an old woman that was cursed as well. So in the story, it's an old Taino legend. There's an old woman and a young woman. And the young woman is banished to live with the old woman. And it's hoped that's enough, but it's not. And eventually a big witch banishes them both, and one becomes a turtle and one becomes a mermaid. And I think because I am now an older woman, I had such a strong feeling about both these women. I remember being young, and I am now living in a different body, and it struck me that it's hard to get it right being a woman. There's always a problem. You know, you're either young, and then you're too young, you're too sexy. This is all the mermaid stories across the world have something in common, which is mermaids are always young. and half naked. So hybrid, but they finish at the waist. So there's no sex. So for me, that was an obvious sign of cursing and banishment, that this very, very beautiful young woman is sealed up. Her sexuality has been banished, has been sealed up. So you can look at her. I think there's a saying, the Spanish say, you can't eat them and you can't fuck them. So there's this kind of like, already she's trapped. She's trapped inside her tail. It's a really, really appropriate thing to do to a young woman who's attracting too many men, too much male attention, is seal her up. The old woman as well gets banished. And so yes, going back to female sexuality and God, I do think that God has a lot of competition in female sexuality. And so most religions like to cover us up. And yeah, there's a big competition here. Women or God. And the taboo is so strong, but yet I don't understand. I mean, there are some pagan churches or pre-Christian churches or sites which are now churches, which have something called, I will stop, Sheila Nagig, which is a woman holding her vagina open. These are in parts of the UK. But I think, yeah, there's been a laying of one thing down to suppress female sexuality. And as a result, and I'll finish here, I don't think women, it's so internalized. It's internalized inside women. Yeah. So if women are carrying this internalized shame, and we don't know what it's like to fully be free sexually, I mean, no one does, you know? Anyway, it's such a big subject. It's my favorite subject.
E a Monique já trouxe uma palavra fundamental para a nossa...
A fundamental word for our conversation is a hybrid. A fundamental word. Hybrid is a fundamental word for our conversation. Of course, I want to hear Colombe about this topic of hybrid. She's French, Jewish, and Monique was born. I'm hearing my translation in French. I don't know if people that were listening to Portuguese. I'm hearing myself, trying to understand what I'm hearing. I was listening to myself. Okay, now in Portuguese, okay. But I was saying that Monique was born in Trinidad and Tobago, and Colombe is French and Jewish, and naturally there's this layer of religion, strong layer of religion concerning the imaginary and culture in which Colombe was raised. So I was like to hear you about this topic of sexuality, woman's body, and God. I loved what Monique said concerning women's sexuality, that women's sexuality is God. It sounded very strong to me. I was raised in Paris. I grew up in Paris in a family where religion did not exist, or at least apparently I had this feeling that we had huge freedom. It was a theme which we never touched. At the beginning, I had a sexual life which, no problem, unbridled. I was 16, 17 years old, and I said, I have a lover. And I was so happy. I wandered around Paris saying this out loud, all over Paris. But very quickly, society explained the opposite to me. It was quite the opposite. Nobody told me that abortion was bad. My parents didn't quarrel with me. Simple, period. We didn't talk about the topic. But perhaps unconsciously, this put a huge weight on me, the fact that I had committed a mistake, not as people who are against abortion say you killed a child in your womb and everything. It wasn't that. That wasn't the point. I was a young girl, well behaved. I wanted to please my parents. I didn't want to be a problem for them. And I felt that in that moment I was causing a problem for my mother. My mother never talked about her own child or her family, and my mother didn't talk to me much. I can't remember my mother having ever touched me, and my mother having kissed me, and this in itself is sexuality already. The child's body, the infant's body, 2 weeks after being born, my mother set me aside. Not that she didn't love me, but she wasn't able to occupy herself. My mother was Jewish, who was separated from her family, and she grew up in occupied Paris, and she menstruated. She didn't even know what it was. When she had her first period, there was blood streaming down her legs, and she didn't even know what it was all about. And so she went to a convent to hide. She left the convent from 12, 13 years old. She was hidden there in the convent because she was Jewish. And her sexuality also was locked up. She'd never touched me. But in the morning, for example, she had to touch me to wake me up and get me out of bed for me to go to school. So what did she do? She pinched me. She didn't touch me. She pinched me. And my sexuality as a woman was that I could not talk about this with my mother. My mother couldn't help protect me during this period of this abortion. So despite the fact that I had actually had the feeling of having free sexuality, it was a lie. It was a trick. There are stories like I had the right to know. I remember that when I was a child, I loved reading. So I read everything that I got my hands on. When, for example, I didn't have anything else to read, I read the telephone book, or I was looking for identities, because in my family there were so many disappeared people. So many people had vanished from the face of the earth, and people that couldn't talk, ghosts. So I needed to find an explanation to be able to feel that I was somewhere, to find the foundations and the base. And we approached sexuality, but sexuality contains a lot of things. It's connected to family, and where there's so many things, the history of the story of a family, the story of your country, and everything that surrounds us. And I didn't begin very well. I hope to have made progress since then. You said that you were quoting in your book that says abortion is always a drama. Ania talks about abortion as a social failure based on it was a family, highly educated activists of political causes. Her mother was a minister, but but the story, however, that story about abortion was never discussed. I was reading the epigram to this book here. It says the following: in your notebooks, there are dreams and secrets. In your school notebooks, all of the words never said. This is very strong, because there's not having been a social drama or health issue, not a social failure. It was never discussed, and it was only discussed so many years later, after a writer like Annie having impelled you to write this book, because this unsaid things. And what relationship does this have with the sexuality that in women? I mentioned silence previously. I was raised in silence about sexuality, about sensuality, about abortion. people didn't talk about bad things. Why? Because in the past was so painful that it was necessary to not talk about it. So everything that came before us didn't even exist. As if it didn't. We were all exiles. We came from elsewhere, and all of the families, there's a past, there's our stories, they exist, nevertheless. I'm not the only family like that. In my home, we could not talk about that. There was silence, shame. The only thing that we could say it was possible to talk about or to say was the candy, the sweets that my grandmother made. My grandmother came from Transylvania, a small country from Hungary, and she made these sweets, these Hungarian sweets, and I became French thanks to French literature and thanks to Annie Ernaux. I can come from a bourgeois family which lived in Paris, in downtown Paris, and when I read Annie Ernaux, and she talked about her shame in her family, she spoke of the issue of the smell of urine, and her grandmother's, she smelled like urine, and I understand perfectly well what she was talking about, this shame. She said that she was a class defector. She came from, I was a class defector, or a defector from another country, and the shame, nevertheless, I carried it with me, and it was thanks to Annie Ernaux that I understood this shame. I don't know if I answered your question. Let's continue with this silence, these silences, and words appear, and it's always a miracle when some words allow us to say things really important. So in Monique's book, there's a deaf boy, and this aspect of not having a language, not being capable of name things is very relevant. And there's a strong symbology to it. And also this mermaid, the mermaid doesn't have, she forgot her mother tongue. She was cloistered in this curse and had been for many years. And she's indigenous. We realize, we see her body, that she has tattoos that show something about, it's very primordial, very old, but she forgot her mother tongue. So we're again seeing the unsaid, not having words, unspoken, in a form of silence, although the circumstances being different from those that Colombe just discussed. So I would like to hear Monique concerning the symbolic character of these two characters, one a deaf boy and a mermaid who had forgotten her mother tongue.
Well, it's interesting because my mother is a hybrid, and she was born with several languages, and she grew up in Egypt, and so she spoke Arabic, and she spoke French, and she spoke Italian, and a bit of everything else. So she was polylingual. But I remember she said to me, I've forgotten my Arabic, because she hadn't spoken it for like 3 or 4 decades. And it made me realize that my mermaid, her identity, there's something about that would have happened to her too. She would have lost her language. And so when she comes back into being in 1976 in the Caribbean, she doesn't know what to say. She hasn't got a voice. Mm-hmm. And so she gets English lessons, or she gets lessons in the language of the island. But the language of the island is Creole. It's a Creolized English. So she learns a new world language. And also she learns sign language immediately with Reggie. Mm-hmm. So very quickly she's learning 2 languages. It just felt like such a natural part of the book that the first thing she would need would be to communicate, and she would have to make do. And with Reggie, who's deaf, they communicate without effort. It's effortless. They understand each other. They're both outsiders. And it's very easy for them to catch each other's way of expressing themselves. But it's not until sex, she has sex, that she remembers again, her language, the old language, her language, because it's like a shock, and then all of a sudden the memories start to come. So it's just a really integral part of this woman who is cursed and exiled. But of course, it's also the language of our Caribbean archipelago of islands, which have been dominated by European languages, but the language wasn't passed on with lessons, so the language was broken and remade, and so we have Creole dialects, we have patois, we have papimiento, we have numerous languages, so it's part of the colonial experience to make up and make do, and as Dion Brand said the other night, is to break language up, to mash it up and make something new out of something very formal like French or Spanish or whatever it is. We have these really interesting ways of making our own thing happen, and this is very much part of the book. She learns, and then, I wanted to, she learns to sign in Creole. And of course, in Trinidad, we do have a deaf school. Every deaf people in the world, there's standard English, American, there's different types of, people don't speak the same English, so deaf people don't speak the same, So it was very exciting to me to be like, wow, language, it's not one thing. It's not one thing at all.
J'avais une question à poser à Monique. C'est une question littéraire. Je voudrais la poser plutôt à la fin.
I would like to ask a question for Monique. I read Monique's book and I recommend it, but the question I'm going to ask you is at the end. But I would like to say something about the words. Language. My parents lived in another world. They didn't have the same words that I have. We didn't have the same vocabulary, the same language. They lived in a country where there was no access to what I experienced in Paris in the 1960s, where I had the right to a lot of freedom, and what they experienced in France. Their family meant that there was no communication amongst them, and between them and me there were words and expressions which they used but which were truly very difficult to translate for me. They talked about Odessa in words in Yiddish, but the translation was never proper. Each of us had their own language, and what you were saying about the language, your mother's language, appeared to me very important and very strong. The language and the tongue of our parents and how we can transmit them. Your mother didn't teach you Arabic, for example, so a lot of languages were not passed down, and a lot of things were not passed down to you because Arabic was not passed down to you. We wrote with these various different layers of the languages, and the readings that we did, obviously. And I would like to know a little bit about your your literary genealogy. Colombe talked about Ernaud. You quote the poem by Pablo Neruda, which serves as an inspiration for you for this mermaid. But I would like for you to give a brief presentation of the authors of your genealogy that inspired you and that helped you to find your own voice, authorial voice.
The other day about all of this, and when I was a young girl, so I'm the first woman in my family to go to university, and my father was a reader, but I didn't want to read his books, in the house. So I used to read my brother's books. They were all adventure books, the old Willard Price adventure books. These are when I was a child. and I like fantasy and vampires. And then if I think about books that really went in early and stayed, I remember reading. I remember reading Jane Eyre, and I remember thinking, "Oh my God, that was just so." It was so dramatic, and Jane and the orphan and hiding behind the curtains and being an outcast, and the whole thing with social class. And I remember thinking, how horrible to be banished to an orphanage, and then she meets the love of her life, and there's a fire, and then there's this mad woman in the attic, and the mad woman in the attic is a vampire. She's hysterical, and all these things. These were what I thought when I was first reading Jane Eyre, and this mad woman, and it wasn't until I grew up and I read The Wide Sargasso Sea by Jean Rhys, who gave the mad woman a story, and that I realized that I was the mad woman. That's me. I wasn't Jane Eyre. I was the mad woman, and they had a lot in common. And I think if I think about my genealogy, I would say it's probably true of many people, if not women, who are Caribbean. And that book is audacious because it dares to write back to an established book and say, you got it wrong, and to revise and make a feminist revision, an intervention in the canon, and to explain why this white woman is mad. And I think I've done something similar with The Mermaid, in that I've revised an old patriarchal myth that this poor cursed woman, she had a story. She deserves to have sexuality as well and a boyfriend. But I think if you think of genealogy, and I think it might be true for quite a few Caribbean writers, that this book, Wide Sargasso Sea, it was like, when I still think of it, I still go, how does anyone write anything better than that? How do you stand up and shout back at the colony or a colonial writer? And Bronte was a great writer. Jane Eyre is a fantastic book. The Brontes wrote great books, Wuthering Heights. But to shout back and say, no, you got this woman here wrong, blah, blah, blah. I could talk for like a half an hour straight about this book. But those are the books, these early books of, I think early on, I now teach, I used to teach the late 20th century novel at university, and many of them are written by men. And the lack of agency of women in most of these books, the role they get, and I could reel them off, including some of the great books written by people like our greats, V.S. Naipaul, etc., Earl Lovelace. All these men are not giving women a central agency. They are the directors. They have, they're not just a sexual object or a mother or something. The second protagonist. So I think there's a lot of work that is being done by feminist writers, by marginalized writers who are putting mermaids or hybrid creatures or women at the center. They're the lead character. The book is about them. Blah, blah, blah. Your genealogy.
Eu gostava só.
If you allow me, I would just like to read the dedication of Monique's book. It says, to Irma, Laure, and Yvette, and the ancestral community before them, to those women from which I was born. It's so beautiful to think about this, to think about ancestrality and all these women who came before, who opened, the trailblazers, who gave us a voice and allowed us to be here. So Colombe, literary genealogy, not only that, but also you're not only an activist, a feminist, and you write that when you were young, you thought that feminism was a struggle that was already decided, with your mother, with your grandmother, and then you saw that, no, well, you know what? No. We still struggle. So in literature, literature is also political, quite clearly. I was 17, and I thought that maybe the feminist struggle was done. I could have a sexual life, I could study, I could work. I was raised along with my brother, and it seemed that everything was the same for both of us. And, but quite suddenly, well, not quite suddenly, but maybe I took some time to understand. But then all of a sudden I thought I was deceived, that that was not the case. And little by little I found this out because maybe when I got married, because I thought that we couldn't live without being married. I thought a woman has to be married. And where did that come from? All this fairy tales that I read, and all the time, you know, and they lived and they married and lived happily ever after with lots of kids. So all of a sudden, and they were happily ever after, right? Always happily ever after. So this fairy tale, this wonderful book by Chekhov, La Dame Opticienne, the obstetrician woman. So this couple, they meet, they are both married, and they end up finding each other. The last sentence of Chekhov is the most, for them, this is the most difficult part that starts now, once they meet. So I said, well, I needed to marry, that's it. And I remember when I was married, I had children, and then when I published my first book, the book was launched, and to publish a first book is huge, huge, right? I guess for you too, it's something huge, right? To publish your first book. And then there is this article of Le Monde, like the biggest newspaper in France. And I brought this to my husband, and I said, oh, I don't have time for that. And then I saw that I couldn't be married and write books, that it would not be possible. And I worked as a journalist, and I worked on TV, and all of a sudden I saw that as a journalist I could interview people, I could present things, but I could not guide the line of thoughts, a school of thoughts. And I said, well, I studied, I'm prepared. Why is this happening to me? Why am I not able to conduct things, to create things? And so it was, let's say, an awareness that was long in coming, to become activist. And it was, all of a sudden, I understood it was a constant struggle every day, every hour, every minute, not only one against the other, but against ourselves. Like many women, I have a number of standards and norms because I read, I see books, I see films, and then there are these standards, these norms that are there embedded, and you have to constantly struggle and fight against these standards, these norms. And so I was not sure what I was. I'm a girl, I'm a boy, I'm feral, I was violent, I was cruel. I wasn't really nice when I was a little girl, but the books have taught me that conversations taught me that I had to be nice and kind and well-mannered. And today, I guess I'm going back. I'm less nice nowadays than what I was. Maybe I'm a bit more careful, and I can be a bit more of myself nowadays.
Eu ia perguntar.
I was going to ask you, twice you talked about being a well-behaved girl, a good girl. And I was going to ask you about the reading and when you're meeting with Simone de Beauvoir and with other authors besides Annie Ernaux and Chekhov that you referred to. Could you talk about other authors that were formative for you? And regarding your work as a journalist also, and this, let's say, a passage into writing. It's quite interesting. When we are journalists, we are listening to others. We are creating the stage for someone else to speak. But when it's writing, it is our own stage. And that's an enormous difference, right? Yes. First of all, I would like to talk about reading. You know, I am, above all, a reader. That was my first job, is to read. What I love to do is to read. That's my main job. That's where I'm good at. And if I allow me to talk about one author, is Marcel Proust. And this, À la recherche du temps perdu. And this is what I've read and I reread. And to me, the first thing is that we cannot be intelligent when we write. It's not necessary to be intelligent. Maybe in Brazil, they will understand this better in France, because you have to be really brainy, you know, like brainiacs to write. But what really matters is the instant, is the moment. It's not the thought. When I wrote this book, I didn't stop and think about it. In 3 hours, I just wrote it. I didn't stop and think about it. I didn't have a project. I didn't have well defined what I had to do. I just knew I had to do it. And it was Marcel Proust, after reading In Search of the Lost Time. You wrote this. You wrote this book with your body, right? You embodied. Yes, true, with my body. And this is Proust. This is Proust who told me to do this. We write with our bodies too, with that moment. And it took me ages to understand that, because in France, you know, you don't have a heart. You just put your heart aside, you know, you put a little makeup and you're good. So the body isn't interesting. Just leave it aside. And it took a long time to me to understand that my body was intelligent, that my gestures were impulsive. And it was Proust that did this for me. In Search of Lost Time, he's always describing their bodies, their gestures, the way they see things, describing everything that we want to hide, that makes a person reflect. And these are masks. And when he describes it, as he does, we have these masks. We take out these masks. We know this person that's scratching their eyebrows all the time. Why do you do? What does that mean? And it is Proust, the first one to describe or write about the body. So in our gestures, in the way that we sometimes, you know, tighten our eyes, we touch our nose, they have something there. There's a meaning and things that we have to know how to read. And this is Proust.
Bom, eu já recebi aqui duas perguntas. Relembro que podem... voltou a acontecer. Agora já estou no português outra vez. Relembro que podem escrever as...
Again, you can submit your questions in writing. People from the team will, of course, get your little slips of paper. But before we go to the questions, I would like to hear if Monique also writes with her body. And it seems that you write with a strengthsome nature, because this book is meshed and perpassed by tectonic movements, hybrid creatures, torments, fish, a rain made of fish. One of the characters is called Rain. And so she is the rain, and chuva in Portuguese. And this is what we're talking about, the body of the planet. And Monique is also an activist on all the environmental issues. So what are the bodies that will allow you to write and make you write?
Gosh, again, I just wanted to come back to what Colombe said, that you don't have to be really, really intelligent to write. I think Proust said that. Proust. Okay. Okay, but
on n'écrit pas avec l'intelligence.
No, we write at the moment. We write at the moment. Above all, it is the moment that makes us write.
I wanted to say something about Virginia Woolf, but maybe that's not relevant. But I think that Virginia Woolf also gave me a way in. She was a memoirist. We're both memoirists. And she was the first person, a modernist, she was a modernist writer, part of a memoir club, which was all male. And she wrote about her abuse, being abused. And the way she wrote was, she was being, why am I talking about Virginia Woolf? Anyway, she was being paid to write biographies of great men. I'm coming to it. She was being paid to write biographies of great men. And she realized that it's full of holes. The stories were full of holes. And so she started writing the truth about herself. And she started very close up, like she was writing about maybe this flower here and then what her body looked like and all these things. And it was just sort of out-of-the-box writing at her time. The waves, the waves going backwards and forwards. She could hear these waves, etc. And, of course, we all write like her now. We all try to get that close. So she broke ground. Writing with my body. So we were talking about my 40s. I had this great sexual renaissance or an uprising. And I explored a lot of sexuality through neo-tantra, tantric practices. which brought me into my lower chakras. This is going to sound very hippie-ish. It is very hippie-ish. But once I, through many trial and error and experiences and years of all of this, it affected the way I think about sex and the body, and it affected the way I write, and it gave me a lot of confidence, and it gave me, I'm very articulate about why I feel very comfortable writing about women's bodies and women's sexuality, and partly because there's so much taboo, it's so invisible, and women we don't even know our own bodies sometimes, and I have such compassion for myself and other women, and how much we need to change, to be penetrative, to penetrate others with our heart. It's going to sound very hippie-ish, but not to constantly be receptive, the receiver, on the receiving end of male gaze, male sexuality, taboo, the church, blah, 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 but to kind of like reflect it back, and also to give and be, like I said, penetrative in our own way, without mimicking men, without being manly, being able to give. We're so guarded, women are so guarded, I'm so guarded, so guarded. So hard to receive a compliment from a man because you think, oh, what's coming next, Oh, you look nice. Okay, that's nice. That's a nice compliment, and I want to fuck you. So it's very hard to like rewrite. It's part of my job is to rewrite being a woman, and it comes from my womb, my yoni, my heart, and I think that's kind of like my blueprint for writing generally. And like you said, you don't need to be read every book in the world to have an Oxbridge degree. And to have been this high-brow person,
So, a couple of questions here, and they're addressed to Colombe, and they are linked. So I will read both of them. One of them is from a person that rather not identify him or herself, saying that in Brazil, abortion is illegal. However, women continue to perform abortion still, and I am one of them. Last year, I was here, and I heard Annie Ernaux, and today, I am able to hear you. How do you feel knowing that your voice has become the voice of many women that continue to feel silenced? To write about abortion. Abortion was at the time illegal in France. I'm always moved when someone comes to me and says, oh, I would like to thank this woman who told me that she did go through an abortion. I guess that the only place where we are able to get a direct contact with someone, because the words will address you and you receive this. We are alone when we read, because that's why I read, because I want to be less alone when I read. And Annie Ernaux said when she had abortion, then there wasn't much to read about abortion. She was trying to look for books, a manual, whatever, something that she could feel that she was being heard. My experience a bit, of course, different from Annie Ernaux, because Annie Ernaux had an abortion in a country such as Brazil now, where it was illegal to have an abortion. So we still, of course, we can't stop a woman from having an abortion. I guess thousands of women will suffer an abortion in Brazil. And since abortion is illegal in Brazil, it will happen in difficult conditions, socially speaking, and also if you have money, of course, it's easier than if you don't. But if it's illegal, you will have sanitary conditions that are sometimes degrading and even, of course, dangerous for your health. And this is why that we need to have a law so that women are allowed to abort without risking their lives. There are women, mothers who die, leave their kids orphaned because they had to go through an abortion. Maria Altero, a French actress, her mother died. She already had 2 children, and she had an abortion. It was a clandestine, and she died during this abortion because it was in horrible sanitary conditions. And it was horrible. Women die because of this. So it's awful. So I cannot compare my experience with what Anyano suffered, because I had this in the comfort of a law. And I was very much aware that it was a privilege to have an abortion when the law allows you to abort. It has nothing to do with an abortion in a country that has illegal abortion. Abortion is the first right of a true democracy. And it's true. It's true. When abortion is forbidden, it means that the woman's body is a lesser thing, that they are not able to decide what their life is going to be, what is the comfort of their body, and they will have to have children, and they're like children, and someone will dictate what they should or not do. We are not minors. We are citizens, at least I think so, right? We can vote in most democracies, and therefore women should have the right to abort.
E a pergunta?
And the question for Monique. So, when I was 15, 13, 14, I was obsessed sexually. I wanted to know how to make love, how did it work, how do you do this, what is an orgasm, this and that. So, I dreamt about having a sexuality teacher, maybe. And I didn't find one. So I had a little boyfriend, and he knew nothing, just like me. So orgasm, I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to work. I thought it didn't exist because it was like a legend. It was a myth. I didn't have there were no words to explain it. And then I read you, Monique, and you had a wonderful sexual education. And in your book, the kisses of his mouth, and then there's a woman who learns how to do erotic massages, and I tried to understand in the book how it worked. Could you show me? Could you explain how this works? Could you explain to us how this works?
No. These are quite intimate.
Quelques conseils.
Oh, just give us some advice, a couple of tips. Tips, come on.
Textbooks. One took me 14 years to write, and one took me a year or two to write. And the fiction was a little bit, I was trapped in a loving relationship, but the sex just wasn't, it wasn't there, it just wasn't there. I was quite young, and so I was truly trapped, and I'm saying I'm trapped because there was a lot of love in the relationship. It's a loving relationship. So I didn't want to leave. I didn't want to leave the relationship. But there was something wrong. And so I started writing something really crazy, and it was full of fantasy. But I didn't get very far with it, and I was ashamed of it. And then this relationship broke. It did break because of the sex problem. And then, as you say, I went on a...
Mais là, tu réponds pas à la question.
Oh, I know. But you want me to tell you how to do a tantric sex massage on a man here live on stage? Is that what you want me to do? I'm not going to. So I'm answering it the way I can. So I then went and did a lot of exploring. And I also think if you want to write about sex, you have to go to the buffet. You have to go and find it. And I'm not talking about vanilla sex, the heterosexual sex that people have every day. I'm talking about everything else and that. And then you can write a book. And you should go and sign up for a workshop. And everybody should. And I had an adult... late life adult sex education, which rearranged the way I think about sex and write about sex. But I mean, it's interesting because it's a long story and we're running out of time.
We want more.
What? So sometimes people
Details,
say...
details.
No, I'm not giving you any details here. I think people have said to me, somebody said to me about The Mermaid. So in The Mermaid, there's a sex scene where the woman has never had sex. And so, and she's not a modern person. She's doesn't even know what sex is. And she just wants to have a go. She knows there's a strong pull. But I really found it challenging to write from the point of view of a woman with no game in her head or no guard. She wasn't guarded. And for her not to try to be a man, to be just confident in a way, and trusting, and herself, and a goddess, and strong. I am rambling now, aren't I? But I think that's the woman I always wanted to be when I was younger. Yeah. I wanted to be that woman when I was younger, yeah. Like the first time, many of my friends, they talk about the first time they ever had sex. It wasn't a good experience. Can we end there?
Bom, terminamos.
We've finished. All good things come to an end. I want to thank Monique Roffey in this beautiful cover, this beautiful edition of the Mermaid of Black Conch. And I would like to also thank Colombe Schneck. This is a beautiful edition as well. This beautiful drawing on the cover, 17 years, and it's edition by Relicario. These authors are going to be right now at the Flip bookstore signing their books. I would like to thank you and ask a round of applause for you all, but applauses for our translators, including, of course, the sign language interpreters. Thank you very much for your kind attention.